The present interview with Professor Noam Chomsky was recorded in his office at the University of Arizona in Tucson on 28 October 2019. The interviewer is Thomas Poggi. Professor Chomsky, you have spent over 70 years analyzing politics and seeking to change it. Looking back on this time, what do you see as some of your most significant successes and failures?
Well, I suppose one success that I never anticipated was in connection with the worst slaughter relative to population since World War II, the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, strongly supported by the United States, other Western powers. It could have been stopped at any moment. It looked like a totally hopeless effort went on. But there were a small number of mostly young people organizing, and finally, after 25 years, it was possible to put enough pressure on the United States for the president to do what he could have done for 25 years and just call it off. Not until almost a third of the population had been wiped out. It's one of the most unequal conflicts I can imagine. A tiny country of 600,000 people fighting off major power, Indonesia, backed by the United States and the European powers, but finally succeeded. That was an unexpected success. Failures, there's too many to mention. In fact, almost everyone failed in some respect. So, for example, I spent a huge amount of time and effort opposing the U.S. wars in Indochina. Was involved in resistance, faced a long jail sentence. Finally, after many years, there was a kind of a settlement, but not until the countries were practically ruined. They never recovered. So it's a very partial success and substantial failure. There are others which could have had success, but have almost completely failed, like trying to preserve some rights for the Palestinian population under Israeli occupation. That's gotten essentially nowhere. And it's one that shouldn't be hard to resolve. It's been known for many years what the resolution should be. There's just no way of compelling the United States particularly to take the steps that are required. Looking over the years, domestically there has been quite a lot of progress. I mean, the civil rights movement had some successes. They were limited but significant. The feminist movement, which I wasn't particularly involved in, has had substantial success. The environmental movements have gone from non-existent to being of considerable significance. The movements, in other cases, it's kind of a partial success. So I was very much involved in the opposition to Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America. The opposition was not only strong, but unique in history. This is the first time in the history of imperialism that citizens of the imperial power not only protested, which is rare enough, but actually went to live with the victims to try to help them, to try to provide what protection whiteface might give in the face of state terror. Thousands of people from Middle America, evangelical churches, rural areas, was very much involved in that. So was it, it's hard to know whether it's a success or failure. A couple 100,000 people were killed. Countries are wrecked. They're practically barely viable today, but it wasn't like Vietnam. The government was prevented from doing the kinds of things that John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did with no protest. chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, vast ethnic cleansing, driving people into concentration camps, B-52 bombing of heavily populated areas. That wasn't done. Would have been, I think, if it hadn't been for the protests. So, in fact, you can even say the same about the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq, which Ken have been much involved in, was the first time in the history of imperialism that a major war of aggression was massively protested, even before it was officially launched. It took place anyway. It was horrible enough. Many consequences, including ISIS and others. But again, the Bush administration and successors could never dream of doing what the U.S. government did with complete impunity in Indochina for many years. So, what can you say? There's some, I can't point to something that's a total success by any means. There are partial successes. There are failures to achieve what one hoped could have been done.
Good. Now, I want to get a little more deeply into what one can learn from the successes and the failures. So, in the last 70 years, we have certainly seen some improvement, as you pointed out. We have also appalling conditions in many other respects, including a lot of poverty, a lot of ecological destruction of our planet, violent conflicts engendering millions of refugees, threats of weapons of mass destruction, other dangerous technologies in the context of a fiercely adversarial state system, and of course mounting inequality with adverse effects on democracy. There is widespread political and corporate corruption facilitated by a mighty network of tax havens, shell companies, sleazy lawyers, accountants, bankers, and financial advisors. And in the face of these large problems and others, we have, of course, practical reason to be optimistic and to tell ourselves and each other that a better world is possible if only we work hard enough to promote it. But if you look at the human world soberly from the standpoint of a seasoned analyst of human affairs, how much chance do you see of a bright future for humanity? How likely is it that humanity will ever realize the kind of decent global political order that we seek and that we believe to be possible?
Well, actually, there's a prior question that has to be asked. How much chance is there for a future for humanity, bright or dark? It's the first time we have to face the fact that for the first time in human history, decisions that will be made within the next few years will in fact determine whether an organized human society can survive in anything like any form that we know about. The environmental crisis is extremely severe. Just happened to read an article a couple of weeks ago by one of the leaders of the IPCC report in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the main journal on these issues, where he starts by saying, let's not mince words, it's time to panic now. We don't have any time to waste. We have a few years in which we can try to deal with these issues. After that, it's finished. If you take a look at the other major threat, which has been hanging over our heads for 75 years, since August 6, 1945, a day I'll never forget. If you look at the record, it's just a miracle that we've survived. Unfortunately, the record is not very much known. Actually, William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, recently said that he's terrified, doubly terrified, first by the enormity of the threat that's developing, secondly by the fact that there's almost no attention being paid to it. And she could add a third reason to be terrified, namely that people who understand very well what they're doing are consciously escalating the threat to the point of major disaster. Just take what happened a couple of weeks ago. The Trump administration celebrated Hiroshima Day by pulling out of the INF Treaty, Gorbachev-Reagan Treaty, which did preserve a modicum of peace and stability for 20 years. Short-range missiles in Europe could easily explode to massive nuclear war, terminal war. They were under pressure. The Reagan administration was under pressure. This goes back to your early question, from very substantial popular mobilization and activism, which laid the basis for making moves towards disarmament. Trump administration dismantled it and almost pleaded with the Russians to respond by doing the same. Immediately after the pulling out of the agreement, the Pentagon tested a missile, obviously long in preparation, which explicitly violated the accord, saying, okay, please come along and do it. The military production companies, corporations are just ecstatic. Huge funding for developing new exotic weaponry, hypersonic missiles that there's no way of defending against. They're exulting. They're even thinking beyond to the further contracts that they're going to get to try to find ways to try to prevent the destruction from the systems they're now developing. We can be certain that the Russians will be doing the same, probably others. That lowers the threshold for terminal destruction quite significantly. So we have three reasons to be terrified, expanding on Perry. One, the growing nature of the threat. Two, the almost total lack of attention to it. Three, the conscious, very conscious escalation of the threat by people who know precisely what they're doing. And the same is true of environmental catastrophe. The threat is very real. There's a degree of protest developing finally, mostly from young people. But the people who understand precisely what they're doing are racing to escalate the threat. Famous example is ExxonMobil. It's well researched. Its scientists were in the lead in the 60s and 70s in studying global warming and its catastrophic effects, producing the most advanced papers in the subject that obviously went to management. And finally, in the late 80s, when the issue began to reach a public audience, mainly with James Hansen's famous speech in 1988, the management did react, namely by pouring money into denialism. Not specific denialism, because they didn't want to say things that could be immediately refuted, but the more clever strategy of just sowing doubt. How do we know? We haven't studied cloud cover. We can appeal to economists who tell us, and there are many, including in your corner of the world, who tell us makes more sense to just let the economies grow, and sooner than richer societies will be able to take care of it, which is kind of analogous to a man falling off a skyscraper who waves to a friend on the 50th floor and says, it's going great, it's always worked in the past, let's keep, that's the economics profession, a large part of it. The government, particularly the United States government under Trump, is the arch criminal of human history, literally. Even Hitler didn't dedicate himself to destroying organized human life on work. But that's exactly what they're doing, and they know it. So, for example, one of the most astonishing documents, official documents, probably in human history, came out about a year ago from one of the Trump bureaucracies, the National Transportation Administration, the 500-page environmental assessment, very careful, very detailed, predicted that by the end of the century, the temperature will have risen 4 degrees centigrade. It's what the World Bank describes as cataclysmic. What the scientific community says is about twice as high as any hope for organized human life. And after reaching this conclusion, they drew a decision. We should do nothing to cut back on automotive emissions. Okay? And the argument is quite sound. It's all over anyway. So let's have fun and make profit for the few years ahead. Can you think of anything like that in human history? Anything remotely like it? But here we come to the triple terrified again. What they describe as terrifying. The response was practically zero. Few articles in the press, and forget about it. And those who know what they're doing are racing ahead to achieve that end. These are, take say, the big banks. J.P. Chase, biggest bank. Its CEO, Jamie Dimon, knows everything that we do about global warming. He's an educated person. How is he reacting? Pouring money into expanding fossil fuel extraction, including the most dangerous fossil fuels like Canadian tar sands, knowing exactly what the consequences are. I wouldn't be surprised if in his private life he's supporting the Sierra Club, but in his institutional role, let's race towards disaster because we make profit that way. ExxonMobil is actually, it is announced that its business program is to maximize fossil fuels, not waste any money on sustainable energy, even though it's profitable, but not as profitable. And they're racing ahead everywhere. Well, that's one part of the world that we face. The other part of the world is groups like Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, which made an actual spectacular achievement. These are a small group of young people protesting and also acting to try to achieve some gains in climate change. They sat in congressional offices, received some support from some of the young women who recently came into office on the swelling wave of the Sanders movement, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mainly. And they succeeded in putting a Green New Deal on the legislative agenda. Some form of Green New Deal is just a prerequisite for survival. 2 years ago, people, if they heard of it, just laughed at it. Now it's on the legislative agenda. There are plans to move forward, maybe not in that form, but in some form. So there are achievements, and there are these two contending forces. One of them, they look very unequal. It's kind of like East Timor. One is young people who want to survive. The other is the major institutions of the society, which want to put more dollars into their overstuffed pockets, whether we survive or not. That's fundamentally the conflict, very unequal one. But it's kind of the same is true on, in a way even more exaggerated, on the nuclear weapons issue, because the popular movements are so meager at this point. They were huge in the early 80s, but have dwindled since, and there's very little knowledge about them. And not many people know anything about the INF Treaty or what it means. The U.S., if you look back, the U.S. claimed that it was pulling out of the treaty because the Russians had violated. That's reported all over the place. Not reported is the fact that the Russians have claimed for years that the United States is violating. Their claims are taken seriously by American specialists. So again, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists recently had a lead article by one of the leading American specialists on these issues, Theodore Postel, which ran through the Russian claims and argued that they're pretty credible. The ABM installations right on the Russian border, which are already a threat, they were placed there on the ludicrous claim that it's got to defend Europe from Iranian non-existent missiles. Can't even laugh. But it's very well understood on all sides that ABMs are not a defensive weapon. They're a first strike weapon. It's inconceivable that they could affect a first strike, but conceivably they might limit a retaliatory strike. So essentially they're a first strike weapon sitting right on the Russian border. Turns out that according to Postal's analysis, that the technology in them is basically dual use, could easily be modified for offensive weapons. And in fact, that's kind of verified by the recent missile test. Turns out the technology that it used, the recent one in August violating the INF Treaty, does in fact use much of the same technology as in the ABM system. So here you have two great powers, each of which is arguing that the other has violated a crucial treaty. In a sane world, it's obvious what would happen. They would move towards negotiations. They'd bring in outside independent experts and try to see what the facts are and resolve them. It's not our world. In an insane world, which is ours, what they do is, let's break the treaty and try to create more destructive weapons without anybody paying attention. That's our world. And here, unfortunately, we're back to the second and the third reason to be terrified. Little attention, and the people involved are racing ahead consciously, including the ones who are pretty much respected, like Jim Mattis, who resigned from the Trump administration because he couldn't stand their policies any longer and is regarded almost with reverence as the one serious adult in the room. He was the one who was behind the new national security strategy, which is virtually insane. I mean, the goal of the national security strategy is to place the United States in a position where it can win two nuclear wars simultaneously against China and Russia. That's beyond insanity. If you had even the beginning of one nuclear war, everybody'd be dead, you know, just from the effects of nuclear winter, even those who carried out the first strike. So we're devoting ourselves to finding a way to destroying the world 50 times over. I mean, it's hard to know what to say about this, and he's respected. Well, that's the problem on the institutional level. On the human level, the popular level, we do have popular movements, mostly young people, not so much on the nuclear issue. And when you turn to the problems of, it's kind of interesting that as you know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has a doomsday clock, which they set every year. Last year, they set it as close as it's ever been to midnight, 2 minutes to midnight, which they called the new abnormal. And they added to the reasons they've used in the past. In the past, it was, of course, the nuclear threat. In recent years, the environmental threat. Now, this time they added a third reason, that basically the deterioration and destruction of democratic forms. Sounds a little different, but it makes sense. That's the only possibility for dealing with the first two issues. And if they decline and deteriorate, what they talked about particularly was the collapse of information systems, with the flooding of so-called information systems by purposely false news, perfect totalitarian technique, flood the information system with so many lies that people don't even know if there's a difference between true and false. So you eliminate the possibility for having rational, deliberative, popular decisions that might confront the problems that we face. And this makes good sense. It's a sensible tactic on the part of those who want to maximize profit and power, don't care what happens in the future, and are perfectly happy, in fact, eager to destroy democratic forms. Actually, that's pretty much implicit in the neoliberal policies that were instituted a generation ago. Reagan, Thatcher, pretty much everyone since. It doesn't take a genius to have forecast exactly what happened. They would lead to high concentration of wealth, narrow concentration. The United States now, 0.1% of the population have over 20% of the wealth. Half the population have negative net worth. I guess that's an immediate consequence of these policies, extreme in the United States for all sorts of reasons, but happening everywhere. Stagnation for the majority. Decline of democracy is almost an immediate corollary from the concentration of wealth, which already overwhelmingly influences policy, even more so with the concentration. Decline of benefits, leaving people naturally angry, resentful, full of contempt for institutions. You see this in every election. The centrist parties collapse, and that's very fertile territory for demagogues who can try to mobilize populations who are angry and resentful to try to focus their attention not on the sources of their problem, put that aside, but on scapegoats. There are people even more vulnerable than they are, immigrants, Muslims, blacks, so on. And that's a very dangerous mix. It's a kind of mix that led to the horrors of fascism. I should say that you said here, I've spent more than 70 years on this, actually 80 years. The first article I wrote in 1939 was on the spread of fascism, which looked inexorable at the time. That was not a very deep insight, 10-year-old picture of it, but it was pretty obvious what was happening. It looked hopeless. This was right after the fall of Barcelona, which ended the Spanish Republic. Austria had been taken over, Czechoslovakia had taken over. It looked like there was no end. And we're sort of back to that in some ways. You know, Trump is not Hitler by a long shot. Doesn't have the ideology or the goals. But listening to his public rallies does bring back memories from childhood of listening to Hitler's Nuremberg rallies over the radio, not understanding the words, but the emotions and the passion. It was frightening. You see it again. I think we're moving into in that area too, both political and economic, which are closely related, moving into very dangerous territory. Fortunately, again, there is opposition. In the United States, Bernie Sanders and the movement he's helped organize has had big effects. A large part of the population now really wants to move at least to traditional social democratic New Deal style policies, which would be a big change, big improvement, but undermine much of what's happening, and the same is true in Europe. It's going to be a long battle, but on almost every front you have this kind of confrontation. It's not for the first time. I mean, this, it's basically class war, which goes far back in history, any other mixtures. But it's taken on at this moment a particularly threatening character because of the enormity of the problems that we're facing. And you can't overestimate that. It's literally the case that this generation is going to have to determine whether organized human society persists. It's nothing short of that.
Are we going to be able to stop it?
Well, let's just go back to my 10-year-old prediction. To me, at that point, it looked unstoppable. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but the U.S. government felt pretty much the same. We didn't know then, we know now, that in 1939, the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, the main extra-governmental, mainly corporate association dealing with foreign affairs, the two of them had set up a study group to try to deal with what would be the post-war world. War Peace Studies Group, it was called. They had very detailed studies that are available now. 1939, they did assume that the United States would end the war, very powerful, victorious, that wasn't a question. But they assumed that there would be another great power, the Germans, that the world would be divided between a US-run region and a German-run region. Pretty much what I guessed as a young kid without knowing anything much. And that was in fact the US area, which they called the Grand Area, would include, of course, the Western Hemisphere, former British Empire, which the US would take over, including the Middle East, of course, and Asia, Asia, was assumed the US would take. The Germans would run the rest of Eurasia. And that lasted pretty much until first Stalingrad and then the tremendous tank battle at Kursk, 1943, which made it pretty clear that the Russians would defeat the Germans, with the Americans and the British hovering around the periphery, which is pretty much what happened. At that point, they switched, and still going to be two worlds, but a different enemy. And in fact, the British, particularly Churchill himself, were already thinking about how we could organize a war against Russia. Churchill had an incredible plan, which came from the British military staff, to try to save the Wehrmacht and the German industry for an immediate war against Russia as soon as the war was over. That was knocked down, probably by Roosevelt mainly. But that's the kind of thinking that was going on. Well, then we go into that era. So, and in fact, many of the programs of the War Peace Studies Group were later formulated in the State Department Policy Planning Bureau and pretty much implemented for many years. That leads us right into the post-war world. And it goes on like that. So as the Soviet Union collapsed, there were illusions that, okay, now we'll have a period of peace, peace dividend, Pentagon budget will cut back, and so on. If anybody had bothered to look at the public documentary record, they would have never thought that for a minute. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Bush administration, the first Bush, released, first of all, a new defense budget, also a security planning document, and these made very interesting reading. Nobody looked at them, but they're public. They said basically we have to keep up the military budget as pretty much as before, no Russians. But and the reason is because I'm not making this up, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we have to have this immense machine which can blow up the world in 5 minutes. Did anybody laugh? Nobody even looked. Then it said we're going to be fighting wars, but these are going to be wars against much weaker enemies. Now we have to defeat them quickly and decisively, or it'll have a negative impact on us. They talked about the Middle East, where main place where U.S. intervention forces are focused under the Carter Doctrine, but even before. And they said we have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And then came this interesting phrase, where the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, sorry folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but it wasn't the Russians at all. It was what they call radical nationalism, independent nationalism that doesn't conform to our goals. So that's why we have to keep these intervention forces focused, which of course was always true, but every single action for the preceding 60 years has been the Russians are coming. So okay, we made a mistake, can't be laid at the Kremlin's door now that there's no Kremlin, but we have to keep doing exactly what we were doing. And it happened almost exactly like that. A couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. invaded Panama. Pretty standard imperial intervention, killed thousands of people, mostly poor people. The goal was to kidnap a guy who was indeed a thug, but a thug who the U.S. introduced, Noriega. he was introduced and supported by the United States, supported him through fake elections. He made a mistake. He started disobeying orders. Okay, we don't take that kind of thing. This is the mafia, after all. Guy starts disobeying orders, cut off his head. So invaded Panama, and managed to kidnap him, take him back to trial, and so on. Overrode UN resolutions and so on. Did anybody care? Everybody cheered. A couple of months later, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He actually had a reason. Claimed that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil, and Iraq had defended the Arab world against Iran in this long battle, and now they were robbing Iraqi oil. Okay, not a justification for invasion, but much more serious argument than the Panama case. His invasion did kill people, according to Human Rights Watch, about 800 people, considerably less than Panama. The U.S. saw an opportunity. Now we can really show our force. Within weeks of the invasion, first of all, there was a lot of fakery about invading Saudi Arabia, and taking over the oil, total fabrication. But within weeks of the invasion, it was clear that Saddam understood he'd made a mistake. He started making offers to negotiate and withdraw under some conditions. All of this was known. Actually, there were leaks from the State Department reporting it. Press wouldn't touch it. I'll tell you a personal anecdote. I knew at that time I was pretty close to the editors of the Boston Globe, the most liberal paper in the country at the time. It's since almost disappeared. And I asked them, could I publish an op-ed about the State Department leaks, which indicate that there could be a negotiated settlement. They were quite friendly at the time. They said, yeah, you can do it, but you have to do it after the U.S. invades. So in fact, they did publish the article, but right after the invasion, January. This is right after the fall of the Soviet Union. Nothing changed. In fact, it's even more extreme. A couple of days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in El Salvador, an elite battalion, Atlacal battalion, which had been responsible for massive atrocities, trained and armed by the United States, just came from renewed training by U.S. Special Forces, broke into the Jesuit University, murdered 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and daughter, to make sure that there'd be no witnesses. Turns out this was on the orders of the Salvadoran government, the government that we supported, which the U.S. Embassy was in close contact with. Can anybody remember their names? I mean, if this had happened in Eastern Europe, there'd be massive protests everywhere. But when we murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, who knows? This was a couple of days after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nothing, And it's not an isolated incident. This kind of closed off the decade of the 80s, which opened with the murder of an archbishop leading Mass, Archbishop Romero. Same hands, basically. U.S. supporting it all the way. Anybody know? I mean, much lesser incidents in Eastern Europe were just the front page blaring headlines. So if it happens among enemies, horrifying. If we do it, who knows? You can give case after case like this. Take Trump's recent betrayal of the Kurds in Syria. Betrayal of the Kurds is practically a qualification for office in the United States. Every president, one after another. Take Ronald Reagan. When his friend Saddam Hussein, who the U.S. was supporting, carried out chemical warfare attacks against Iraqi Kurds, the Halabja massacre and others, huge atrocities. How did government react? Well, Congress tried to protest. Reagan vetoed it. Reagan and his administration tried to blame it on Iran and protect it from Saddam Hussein. Later, when they wanted to invade Iraq, they brought that up as a reason why we have to invade Iraq. You know, look at this terrible guy. I mean, this goes on without change. It's just almost fixed. You know, didn't understand it in 1939, but basically that's what we've been seeing since. There are blips, like when the Soviet Union collapsed, there's slight changes in strategy, but fundamentally nothing different. Well, on the other hand, that's one side. On the other hand, you have had powerful movements of protest. The anti-war movement in Indochina took many, many years to develop, waited far too long, but it finally did grow to the point where it limited and probably terminated Nixon's efforts to escalate the war.
But now the time that we have left is very limited from what you had said earlier. We have little time, and
now we have almost no time.
Yeah,
and the problems are, I mean, the destruction of Indochina was bad enough, but now we're talking about the survival of human society. That's in our hands right now. And it's utterly scandalous that the lead in struggling against this is teenage kids. Where's the rest of us? You know, Greta Thunberg, okay, marvelous person, but why a 16-year-old kid?
Yeah, indeed.
And you know, when she testifies at the UN, everyone nods their heads and pats her on the head, very nice. And it goes back to exactly where you were.
Yeah. So again, the question, how optimistic are you that humanity can actually overcome these problems, or will overcome these problems?
You know, it's really not the right question. I mean, you have two choices. You can decide it's all hopeless, and give up, and make sure that the worst will happen. Or you can try to grasp what opportunities there are, and they do exist, and dedicate yourself to that. Maybe you'll make a better world.
So
those are the choices
ask
always.
The theoretical question.
Doesn't matter what your
practical
predictions
question.
are, which don't mean anything anyway.
Good. So then I come to the next one. Learning from the last 50 years of progressive politics, what advice would you give to the next generation? How can they be more successful than your generation has been? Should they aim to build a more focused movement that attacks the great political evils in a certain plausible order? If so, what is the essential problem on which progressive political energies should now be focused?
Well, I think there are dangers. There's always the tendency towards adventurism, and not thinking through the consequences of what you're doing, but doing it because you think the problems are so terrible, we just have to act out. So, for example, take, say, the weathermen at the latter part of the Vietnam War. Young kids, nice kids, I knew a lot of them, horrified about the war, feeling this is so awful, we've just got to march down Main Street and break windows and attack banks and so on. The Vietnamese were horrified. I remember meetings with Vietnamese saying, you've got to talk them out of doing this. What they wanted was mild protests, so mild that the peace movement laughed at them, because the Vietnamese didn't care how Americans felt. They wanted to survive. And they understood that if you carry out weatherman-style activities, you're just increasing support for the war. So maybe you'll feel good, but we won't. We'll be killed. That happens all the time. And those are, and it's very easy, particularly among young people, be really upset, want to do something wild. You have to think carefully through the consequences of the tactics you adopt. Choosing tactics is not a trivial matter. That's what human consequences depend on, your choice of tactics. And you can find case after case right now where that's not considered thoughtfully and properly. Second thing to watch out for is infiltration. So in the anti-war movement in the 60s, we learned very quickly that almost every group was infiltrated by government agents. And they weren't very hard to pick out. So if somebody was dressed the Hollywood version of what a hippie looks like and was saying, let's off the cops, you could be pretty sure that he'd show up at a trial testifying for the government pretty soon. But nevertheless, you had to be careful about it. And in fact, when we were doing anything sensitive with human lives at stake, like helping deserters out of the country or something, we always did it in affinity groups of people who just knew each other, because there was no way of being sure who the infiltrators are. They're going to be there. I'm sure they're there now. When protests are, getting violent, I immediately get suspicious. This has always, in the past, been an effort by official sources to try to raise the level of violence, discredit the popular movements, build up opposition to them, and shift debate and discussion to the arena of violence, which is where the powerful win. So those are things to watch out for. Another thing is what's called identity politics makes perfect sense. There are serious issues, but they have to be integrated with others. People who are dedicated to one particular concern, say police brutality against black kids or something, have to be able to work with others who have other concerns, what's sometimes called intersectionality, and work for common causes, maybe compromising your own in the interests of others when it's necessary to do so. But these are all kind of the kinds of pitfalls that occur in all sorts of activism. But they can be overcome. And the main, it's also another pitfall is what the government is and the establishment altogether is always trying to get you to do. Reduce your political activism to pushing a button every 4 years and then go home. Take a look at the media coverage, the liberal media coverage of Bernie Sanders. It's pretty striking. They hate him. And so, for example, the New York Times recently, a couple days ago, had an article on the Democratic establishment and how they're not sure that their candidates are really the right ones. Maybe they should bring in Hillary Clinton or somebody else. And they go through the top Democratic candidates. Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg. Somebody missing? Yeah. He's anathema. And it's not because of his policies. It's because he made a real error. He organized a popular movement that doesn't just focus on every 4 years, but is acting constantly, like the ones who broke into the congressional offices and managed to get the Green New Deal on the agenda. That's not what people are for. This goes way back in history. Framing of the Constitution, the British Civil War, British Glorious Revolution in the 17th century. The rebel, as they were called, have their place. They're spectators, not participants. That's in fact liberal democratic theory. Walter Lippmann, founders of modern political science and so on. You know your place. It's not your business to run things. That's for us. And breaking that is a very important thing. If popular movements are going to be effective, they're going to be constant. There's nothing wrong with participating in electoral politics, but that's a pretty marginal part of it. It's the other things you do that matter. That's another pitfall to worry about. On the other hand, the advice is just obvious. There are existential issues that just have to be in the forefront. If they're not settled, nothing else is going to matter. So unless we end the threat of nuclear war and mitigate or hopefully end the threat of environmental catastrophe, it's not going to matter what else happens. A couple of decades, it'll all be over. So those have to be front and center. And then everything else, as the doomsday clock, people who set the doomsday clock pointed out, the deterioration of democratic structures and the collapse of information systems is a major problem. That's a powerful totalitarian device, which is going to block effective action to deal with the major issues. So that has to be overcome. The problem of massive inequality, say in Europe, where it's really extreme, where the policy choices have almost been taken out of the hands of populations. It's all in the hands of an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. That's part of the European Union structure at this point. No wonder people are angry and upset, since everything's taken out of their hands anyway, along with the highly destructive austerity programs, which have no serious economic basis and are just devastating societies. I mean, still rich societies and have lots of protection from their traditional social structure, but it's battering away at them. In the United States, it's worse because the structure is much weaker. But all of these things have to be addressed at the same time as problems of sexism, misogyny, anti-immigrant hysteria, children in concentration camps along the border not very far from us. All these things have to be dealt with, and they all integrate, they all interact with one another. Where you put your energy depends on your personal tastes, concerns, what strikes you, what you think you're good at. But it has to be done with an eye to the validity of parallel concerns on the side, which we hope to interact with. It's not an easy task, and it's, again, scandalous that this burden is placed on teenage kids.
So impact is obviously one very important consideration. Impact, where can I have the most impact on history? But there are other considerations as well, sort of the ends don't always justify the means, you might say, and you have spent a considerable amount of time as a kind of witness to history, collecting information and evidence showing what actually happened, setting the record straight, even when the victims in the particular case that you were focusing on could no longer really benefit from that. So how do you trade off these concerns? What do you think are the standards by which you have oriented your political life?
I mean, there are some standards which are virtual truisms, like the major existential concerns always have to be in the forefront. But for a particular individual, what he or she does depends on individual characteristics. What issue strikes you as the kind of thing you can do something about? Maybe it's fixing things in the local community where you live. Okay, and do that. There's no general principle. It can't be. Life is not an axiom.
Yeah, but I mean, for you personally, how have you resolved these things?
It's very hard to say. Like, why say pick out East Timor?
Yeah.
You know why? Because I barely knew about it. There was nothing reported about it. But there were 2 or 3 young people, as usual, happened to be graduate students in an East Asia Studies program, the best one at Cornell, students of George Cahan, great Southeast Asia scholar, who learned about the East Timor situation, were appalled by it. Arnold Cohen was the main one, should get 10 Nobel Prizes if they meant anything, and began to try to organize support for it. Contacted me, we talked about it, I went to some meetings, and he went on. He's almost unknown, but he's personally has most of the responsibility for the fact that it finally ended. He purposely kept quiet in the background, and that happened to be my personal. Once I got involved, once you put your toe in one of these things, you're caught, no matter what it is. They're so dramatic, like you go to as I've done, to a poor village in southern Colombia, hours away from the Pan-American Highway. You finally get there over a dirt road. You pass a small cemetery with some wooden crosses where people in the village were wiped out by U.S.-backed paramilitaries. And get into the village and talk to the people and so on. After that, you're just people who are trying to protect the mountain near their village from being taken over by Canadian mining corporations, which will wipe out their agriculture, their water supply, and so on. They just spend a couple hours like that, and you're just immersed in that problem. And the same is true almost everything. Go downtown and spend some time with homeless people. Okay, but anywhere you look, there's problems so gripping and dramatic that you just can't help being involved in them. And it's just a choice. You can't do everything. So you try to pick things that somehow matter to you.
One thing that you already mentioned is this inexorable rise in inequality. Wealth inequality you mentioned. You also mentioned how that corrodes democracy and any kind of political equality. Is there any way that, or how could that possibly be rolled back? How can we get to a world in which...
Plenty of ways. They're not very mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a wealth tax, not in the way it was done in Europe, which didn't work. There were too many evasions. But it can be done without all of that evasive structure that Europe had built in. That I think could work. Actually, Vmh10WtC7ws, who talking about have very concrete plans for that. That would make a difference.
Could it be passed politically? Could it get through
that
the Congress?
Depends on the strength of popular movements.
Mm-hmm.
Anything can be passed if you have enough popular support for it. If you're banging on the doors of the members of Congress, no matter how much they're being paid off, they have to be elected. Okay, so that's that can be passed. Yes, no, it won't be easy. Financial transaction tax would make a lot of sense. It would bring in plenty of money. It would cut back the operations of the financial institutions, which are simply destructive and predatory, like whether you can make a trade, a microsecond before the guy across the street. So, all of that, plenty of things. The tax, here's something where public opinion has been very strong for years. For about 40 years, I guess, the polls have been taken on the United States on taxes. And basically, two questions asked. Do you think your taxes are too high? Everybody says yes. Do you think taxes on the rich are too low? Everybody says yes. You take a look, there's a couple of papers on this in political science literature. You take a look at the media reports. They don't report the first. Taxes are too low. Actually, that's a very interesting result. That's kind of a measure of whether democracies function. If you had a functioning democracy, people would celebrate the day when they pay their taxes. Great. This is the day when we've made decisions about what has to be done in the society and how much everyone should contribute. Now these decisions are being implemented. Let's cheer. The more taxes are opposed and feared, the more you know democracy isn't functioning. The slogan, there's nothing you can get away with except death and you can't get away with death and taxes. That's telling you we don't live in a democracy. It's a very simple measure. And the fact that people think their taxes are too high is telling you we don't believe with anything that's being done, that those guys up there are making decisions we don't have anything to do with it. They're stealing from us. Okay? We have to move towards a society where you celebrate your joint decisions about how to keep your societies running effectively. I'm glad I want to have my schools running. I'd like to have a park. I want to be able to drive on the roads. So great. We're very far from that.
Yeah. And given globalization, of course, the problem of inequality is even greater because rich people can play off different countries against each other and can basically take their money out, get a different citizenship.
Well, that was the problem with the European wealth tax.
Yeah.
It was set up in such a way that somebody in France could pretend to be in Luxembourg. But that's not necessary. You can have constraints against that. So, for example, in the U.S. system, theoretically, it's not implemented. A person is taxed, a U.S. citizen is taxed no matter where he is. And you can, now somebody could say, okay, I'll give him up my citizenship, but not many people are going to do that to save a little money. The tax havens are instituted by policy. That's not a law of nature. They take trillions of dollars. By some estimates, maybe $20 trillion. Like Apple Computers, the biggest corporation, its corporate headquarters are in Ireland, where they probably have an office about this size and a secretary. It's not graven in stone. All of these things can be dealt with. But certainly there's going to be barriers, just like we were talking about before, the exorbitant protectionist principles that are written into the World Trade Organization, radically anti-free trade agreements, the intellectual property rights have patent rights way beyond anything in the past. If they had been a part of the international system 200 years ago, the United States would be exporting fish and fur. It would be impossible to develop. They shouldn't exist. There's a lot of bipartisan protest here in the United States against China because it's not observing intellectual property rights. The population should be cheering. Who gains from the fact that there's exorbitant patents on pharmaceuticals? Not people. They suffer from it. So the pharmaceutical corporations make even more astronomical profits than they would if you had a reasonable regime. All of these things are under control. These people understand them. They know about them. In fact, the attack on China is extremely interesting. The main theme is China's taking away our jobs. Think about it for a second. Is the Chinese government holding a pistol to the head of the Apple Corporation saying you've got to invest here, or Boeing or IBM or anyone? No. It's the guys who are taking away our jobs, or the bankers and investment managers in New York and Chicago who run the corporations. So let's go after them, not after China. All of these things are elementary, As soon as you point them out, everybody understands them. So what you have to do is just to take away this thin cover of deceptive propaganda, let people look at the world, and I think they can understand very well that there are many things they can do.
Good. I think we have to come to a close, and I want to thank you very, very much for giving us the time and giving us your responses to these questions. And with luck, we can have a little bit of a discussion on the day of the event. We'll see.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to go off to the next meeting.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Great to see you.